to welcome all of you to this all-important video conference on a pertinent issue that affects democratization processes across Africa. As you may already be aware, in October of 2019, NDI and its partner organizations, OSIWA, the Africa Forum, and the Kofi Annan Foundation co-hosted in Niamey, Niger Republic, a conference on this subject matter. The inaugural speaker for the conference was the President of Niger Republic, His Excellency Muhammadu Issoufou, who pledged his commitment to respecting the constitution of his country and to not serve more than 2 terms in office. The Niamey conference was also highly attended by several former heads of states of African countries, as well as civil society leaders, including many journalists and bloggers. After the Niger conference, at which we signed the Niamey Declaration, we agreed to hold a second follow-up conference in 2020. But lo and behold, we have now been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has made it difficult for us to assemble all of you in one location on the continent to pursue our conversations on this very pertinent issue. We've therefore resorted to a virtual conference. And in some ways, the beauty of that is that it's allowed us to have this platform on which we can draw upon experts and participants across the entire continent, and even amongst friends of Africa in North America and Europe and other parts of the world, something that we certainly would not have been able to do were we meeting in a physical location. We therefore plan to make the best use of this opportunity. We invite all of you to participate as interactively as you can to enrich the discussions and our deliberations. I want to express our enormous gratitude to our partners and the co-hosts of this event, notably Open Society Institute of West Africa, OSIWA, Open Society of Southern Africa, OSISA, the Africa Forum, which is an organization of former African heads of states that are committed to democratic processes, the Kofi Annan Foundation that's based in Geneva and continues to work on democracy and human rights and the issues that former and late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, a son of the soil, cared very much about. The Katiba Institute of Nairobi, Kenya, La Page, which is a coalition of civil society organizations very engaged on this issue, as well as Africtivist, which is another organization of African civil society organizations. And so these 7 organizations have teamed up their efforts to build synergies in various initiatives that we continue to undertake across the continent. I therefore also want to thank our panelists and the moderators who have volunteered their time and their expertise to enrich this conversation and this discussion. We're very indebted to you. And finally, to thank each and every one of you for making the time to be an active participant in this process. We know that in many different ways, you already carry the mantle of the debate on this issue in your respective countries and in your respective subregions across the continent. We're just delighted that you're making the time to be part of this holistic effort, and that going forward, we will be able to count on you as a partner in this endeavor. I hope we will have very enriching and substantive debates and discussions in the next 3 days, and I wish you all a very successful video conference. Without much ado, I would ask you to join me in welcoming the president of the National Democratic Institute, Ambassador Mitchell, and Ambassador Derek Mitchell, who has got opening remarks for us. Over to you, Ambassador Derek Mitchell.
Distinguished guests, my name is Derek Mitchell, President of the National Democratic Institute. On behalf of NDI, I am pleased to welcome everyone today to this conference on constitutional term limits, the second inter-African discussion NDI has hosted on this important topic. I don't need to tell everyone here today that since our last meeting on this topic in Niamey last year, much has changed on the African continent and indeed everywhere. The COVID-19 pandemic has not only threatened the physical health of citizens around the world, but also the economic, social, and political health of many societies. That said, since last October, several African countries have held presidential elections successfully. They were able to maintain democratic standards and continue progress to ensure peaceful democratic transitions on the continent. However, there is also a growing pattern of modifying or eliminating term limits that, if it continues, will carry far-reaching consequences for African governance, stability, and development. I will reiterate what I stressed at last year's conference. Citizen confidence that their elected leaders will respect the constitutional order, including their responsibility to accept term limits, is an essential cornerstone of democracy. Accountability and the regular rotation of political leadership through the ballot box is essential. Since rejoining NDI as president in 2018, I have met many African leaders, politicians, and activists who are committed to these principles. Last year's conference was a landmark event in getting buy-in to these norms from many of these leaders throughout the continent. Nonetheless, over the past year, we have seen backsliding in Africa and around the world. That means we all must rededicate ourselves with a renewed sense of urgency and purpose to fight for the integrity of democratic systems and respect for constitutional term limits wherever they are undermined or challenged. This is our purpose in gathering such a distinguished group of former heads of state, civil society leaders, and academics once again, to candidly review the state of affairs a year after the Niamey summit and recommit ourselves to action. We are grateful you all have chosen to participate and admire your continued commitment and leadership on this critical subject. Thanks to technology, this year we are able to do things we have not been able to do, even just a year ago. We have attracted an even more diverse group of attendees from 20 countries. We are live streaming and recording the entire event, and will make the proceedings available as a reference on both the NDI and Term Limits Initiative websites. I want to thank NDI's partners who have helped to make this event possible, notably the Africa Forum, the Open Society Initiatives for West Africa and Southern Africa, and the Kofi Annan Foundation. We always value highly our work together and look forward to much more partnership in the future. And finally, I want to extend my special gratitude to Chris Fumunyo and Dixon Amundi, NDI's Africa directors, for their hard work and that of their teams to help shape this initiative. They have had to adapt this project to account for the complicated virtual times we live in, and I thank them. I hope the next time we all gather together, we may once again do so in person for these important conversations. Thanks again to everyone attending this year for your continued dedication, vision, and leadership to promote respect for term limits and democratic constitutionalism in Africa. I wish you all the very best during the discussion in coming days, and for health and happiness in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Derek Mitchell. You got us up to a great start. And now I'll call on our friends from Slam Activist to give us a song led by Kong G and the Niu Beats.
Papa. Papa. Papa fois, de l'autre côté de l'histoire, nous avons accroché notre espoir à la cône de l'Afrique. Nous avons cherché à transformer les guerres et les croisades en des embrassades. Nous avons cherché la paix dans une boîte de conserve. Cherché le bonheur dans une bouteille de bière. Cherché la liberté dans un plat de caviar. En oubliant que tu les avais tous dans la poche de ton cœur. Papa, je ne veux plus que la télé nous regarde. Je veux la regarder aussi. Maman a dit que tu t'es fait beaucoup d'ennemis, qu'elle ne te reconnaissait plus, que tu étais là juste pour un temps, mais que tu as décidé de faire un autre mandat, papa. Elle pleure quand tu n'es pas là. Elle dit qu'elle a peur de mourir dans la peur. Et chaque applaudissement qu'on claque à un mandat de trop est une colombe qu'on écrase. Et chaque applaudissement qu'on claque à un mandat de trop est une colombe qu'on écrase. Alors ne casse pas le flambeau, papa, passe-le. Pour nous, pour toi, pour le peuple. Ne casse pas le flambeau, papa, passe-le. Pour nous, pour toi, pour le peuple. 1, 2, 3 et je compte sur toi, papa. Si on ne change pas, il fera toujours minuit en Afrique. Papa, la limitation des mandats est l'éponge qui s'imbibe dans notre sang longtemps coulé, qui éponge nos sueurs qui ont perdu leur goût salé. Ta famille a aussi besoin que tu sois un père et pas le père d'un peuple. Un pays ne se construit pas seul. Même le Christ a laissé le pouvoir aux apôtres. Ce n'est pas la durée qui fera de toi un bon président, non papa, mais ta capacité à compter 2 doigts sans en ajouter un autre. Que nous laisseras-tu, papa? Que laisseras-tu dans la mémoire de notre pays? L'histoire nous avalera-t-elle ou nous vomira? Sors dans l'honneur par la grande porte. Entre par la stargate et tu seras un héros. Être au sommet ne fait pas toujours de toi un grand, non papa. On n'a pas forcément besoin d'avoir un fauteuil présidentiel pour être bien assis. Tu quitteras le pouvoir, mais tu ne le perdras pas. Même la retraite est aussi le fruit d'un bon travail, papa. Et chaque applaudissement qu'on claque à un mandat de trop est une colombe qu'on écrase. Alors ne casse pas le flambeau, papa, passe-le. Pour nous, pour toi, pour le peuple. Ne casse pas le flambeau, papa, passe-le. Pour nous, pour toi, pour le peuple. 1, 2, 3, et je compte sur toi, papa. Si on ne change pas, il fera toujours minuit en Afrique. Placide Kona.
Wow. That was so powerful. More than a song, it's a poem, very poignant, and really puts the finger on the issue and basically says to African leaders, don't break the torch of light. Pass it on to the next leader, to the next generation. This is so powerful and so appropriate for this conversation. Thank you so much, Konji and Slam TVist, for this wonderful presentation. Next, I want to bring you a distinguished gentleman who really shouldn't need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce him very briefly. Professor Yash Gay, someone who has a very unique combination of academic excellence and practical practitioners' experience in dealing with constitutions, not just in Africa, but across the globe. Professor Guy studied in many universities, some of the most prestigious universities across the globe, including the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, the University of Harvard in the United States of America. He also has been a professor in universities in Africa, in Europe, in North America, as well as in the Asia-Pacific region, and has written over 20 books and 170 scholarly articles, many of them on the issue before us today. Also, as a practitioner, he has helped write the constitutions of many countries in transition, including working on the 2010 Constitutional Review Commission for Kenya that gave birth to the current constitution of the country. In 2011, Professor Guy founded the Katiba Institute of Kenya to monitor the implementation and the efficacy of the constitution that the country now has. His institute is an integral part of this initiative going back to our first conference in Niamey, and we are extremely delighted that Professor Yash Guy has agreed to join us this afternoon or this morning and to give us a synopsis on where the issue of term limits and constitutionalism can be situated as we speak on the African continent. So please join me in welcoming Professor Yash Guy. Over to you, Professor.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. I have made some notes, and if you have time for discussion, I'll be happy to deal with some questions. There are stories that some traditional African societies, especially kingdoms, would remove or even kill the kings, particularly if they were guilty of misbehavior or if they became sick or weak. Some even supposedly killed them after a fixed time. How true this was and precisely what the motive was is not always clear. But it is an interesting contrast with some of the modern presidents who have clung on to power when they could no longer wield it justly or even effectively. At independence, there were no real constitutional provisions for term limits. Former British colonies mostly became independent with a parliamentary system. There are traditionally no limits to how long a prime minister may serve, and the head of state was formerly the British monarch who reigned for life, in fact is still there, and the executive head of state was the Governor General who held office during the pleasure of the monarch. In reality, there was a convention of serving for 5 years, but the colonial office lawyers would not at that moment have dreamed of selling the Queen her representative could legally serve for only 5 years. The countries then shifted to presidential systems, and some thereafter to military rule. Some went through a stage of being a republic, but still a parliamentary system. This process, when not involving military rule, usually involved an assertion of power and sense of indispensability on the part of the incumbent president. It was not until later that term limits began to be introduced. They were not necessarily greeted with enthusiasm by the incumbents, as you can imagine. In Kenya, a limit was introduced in 1992, by which time President Moi had already been in power for 14 years. Moi refused to accept that the term limits applied retrospectively. That is, he stayed on for a further 10 years. When new constitutions came to be written, a military rule or after autocratic rule, the norm was to have a term limit for the president. By this time, parliamentary systems had quite disappeared. Except in Mauritius, they still have a parliamentary system. Apart from them, the president to ceremonial has mixed terms, the prime minister does not. So about the only place in Africa with the parliamentary kind of system. It is, I think, right to say that in most countries on the continent, some head of state has tried to extend his term, the only woman left after her 2 terms. There are, of course, some leaders who have conducted their duties in such excellent ways without personal profits that the public would like them to stay on. The first post-apartheid South African president, President Mandela, was one such. He was asked to stay on, but he said, no, I must make place for my successor. And in South Africa, so far, the ANC is so powerful that not only is it not likely to approve an extension of presidential terms, but it actually removes presidents before they have finished their terms. And this is a way it is to learn that if you have a strong political party, you might actually find that you cannot extend your term. It's an interesting thought. Tanzania has also been different. Nyerere did continue for some time, and I was at that time teaching in Dar es Salaam with the great support of the people for the excellent and honest way he conducted his first term. No one would have dreamed of limiting Mwalimu's term of office. Even when retired, his influence was high, and in a way, his successors would also turn to him for guidance. But as he retired, term limits were introduced. They have been respected. But even last year, there were signs that Magufuli might not be happy to emulate his predecessors and live at the end of his second term. Well, that is a very important issue among us in East Africa, and we need to see exactly what is happening. And his conduct at the moment is not one that inspires confidence. Some people who have remained in power have been there for a really long time. One report said recently, in 2020, 3 sitting African heads of state have been in power for more than 3 decades each. Teodoro Obiang Nyubuya, Basaso, I can't pronounce it all, in Equatorial Guinea, Paul Biya in Cameroon, and Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. I have to say, my former student learned bad habits. More than a dozen other African heads of state have been in power for at least 10 years. In August 2017, Angolan President José Eduardo de Santos stepped down after 38 years in office, and in November of that year, Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe was forced from office after 37 years by a military coup. In 2019, Sudan's Omar al-Bashir was ousted after 3 decades in office. A bit like independent leaders, some of these, believing themselves indispensable, also seem to have convinced their people. However, the fate of Mugabe and Omar al-Bashir shows that this sense that a country can manage without a particular leader can eventually fade. But what damages they can do in the meantime, and what harm forceful removal of a leader can cause. Zimbabwe is well struggling, so is Sudan, to establish a democratic regime that is responsible to what the people want. These long-term leaders, I should say, do not plan for their own successions. Why should they? It is not the business of a current president to plan his or her succession, but they should also tend to prevent the emergence of a credible leader to succeed them. And possible leaders either risk injury or worse, or lie low, decide to cooperate with the government or to go into exile. So hardly anyone is available with experience and credibility to take over when the inevitable happens and the invisible leader either dies or is forcibly removed. Even with term limits, when presidents see the end of the last term approaching, they may start to think about their legacy. I have to go. What shall I leave behind? Unfortunately, they seem just as likely to focus on whether there is some way they can continue to have a political career. Maybe they hope to ensure that their successor is of their choice and indebted to them. Maybe they refuse to accept retirement and even hope to change the constitution to remove the term limit. Maybe they can hope to change the constitution to a different system that has a role for them. The more we do to reinforce term limits, the better. Let future presidents know that limits are fixed in stone. Maybe they would shift their focus to delivering to their people. Of course, term limits and elections are no guarantee of a responsive government. Unfortunately, they do not seem to have any guarantee of the emergence of credible successors, at least not in Kenya. When you look at Kenya's history, we had on independence Jomo Kenyatta on a parliamentary system. But before his term ended, he abolished that and converted the country into a presidency and stayed on for a very long time. And then his son took over after the lap of one in between. So he is now in his second term, so that he would have been 10 years. So if you add the entire occupation by the Kenyatta family, it is enormous. And at the moment, it seems to us here that he is in one way or another going to have a lot of influence in the country. And finally, I would like to say that we also have to look at the questions of other than just being head of a state. There's a big questions of the control of the economy. This is a big issue in Africa. the way in which the economic issues are dealt with, distributed, have a long life. And we are today in Kenya grappling with this problem. We have now very soon elections for a change of government, but it has become always clear that our president will still be playing a critical role in government, have government resources. And so I think we can't say it's simply this or simple that. That once you get into a power structure and you get the people, you get about 5-6 tribes, they control the whole country. So I think we ought to look also not just at the more formal technical framework, but we should also look at the broader issues that have taken control of the system of government. Well, I have spoken for a long time, and I haven't been kind to my government, but at least we have the position that we can be liberal, we can be open. And I have frequent columns in the papers which are a strong attack on our president. So far, I have not been sent to prison. If I am, I'm sure you will all help me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yash Gay. You really laid out the issues very beautifully, and thanks for that historical overview. And as you said so rightly, maybe if leaders knew that they were term limited, they would then focus on delivering services to their people. That's really a beautiful quote that we could get from your expose. Let me also remind our participants that this event is on the record. It's being streamed live on the Facebook pages of the co-hosting organizations. We encourage all of you participants to also share the link so we can spread the conversation across the continent. I will now proceed to introduce the moderator of our first panel. As you are aware, we've assembled 3 panels for the 3 days of discussion. Panels composed of real experts and practitioners on this issue. And our first panel is going to be moderated by Ishimuli Kada. Ishimuli is a sister of ours who is a program manager with Open Society Southern Africa, an organization that she joined 5 years ago in 2015. Prior to that, she had been very active in the private sector, especially including with the South African petroleum company, Petro SA. She, in her current position, focuses on issues of integrity, elections, governance, and has herself been engaged in numerous academic exercises in preparing for a master's degree on the issues that are pertinent to our discussions today. We are extremely delighted that Ishimuli has accepted to moderate this panel, and please join me in welcoming her to the podium. Over to you, Ishimuli.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much, Chris. Am I audible? I suspect if nobody speaks up, then I am, yes? Great, okay. So I suppose I'll start with a good morning for those in the far in the US. Good afternoon to the comrades in Southern Africa, and good evening to the colleagues joining us from East Africa. Welcome to panel 1 of the virtual Constitutional Limits Conference, where we'll be discussing why term limits matter. We have an eminent panel of speakers joining us for what will undoubtedly be a lively and informative conversation, and I greatly look forward to facilitating the next 90 minutes. Just a few thoughts from my side to frame the panel, and as I start to introduce the panelists. The third wave of democracy on the continent delivered consensus around the centrality of democratization and the consolidation of the attendant democratic institutions, as well as measures to counteract unbridled executive power. These included the promotion of the principles of judicial independence, decentralization of governance, strengthening Parliament's oversight role, the regular holding of free, fair, and credible elections, and of course, what to some is a swear word, term limits, which we're here to discuss. Presidents, as we now know, have direct incentives for remaining in power beyond the limitations to their terms that are imposed in constitutions. They're also imposed in other instruments, as well as through regional and continental norms. These can range from a belief that the business of development is unfinished to evading the facing of charges for illegal actions committed during their terms in office, including corruption, which is a problem that we face throughout. Various instruments are used to extend terms of office, including manipulating or replacing the constitution, as well as taking control of the judiciary to ensure its pliability when needed. At times, the electoral framework, as well as electoral management bodies, are also tampered with to maintain the incumbent's stranglehold on power. These unconstitutional actions aimed at retaining power and control undermine democratic consolidation. They undermine popular will and have an adverse impact on peace and security at the country as well as at the regional levels. They also weaken sustainable democratic governance. Now, gauging from the reality that the majority of constitutions do in fact have term limit clauses embedded in them, it seems that it's widely accepted that term limits have a bearing on the quality of constitutional democracy. However, there is a debate ongoing about whether the conditions around term limits embedded in constitutions have the opposite effect, where incumbents, seeing what can be termed as the end game, dig in their heels to maintain their power and privilege that comes with holding the highest office. But surely this is a compliance problem rather than a fundamental flaw in the norm of constitutional limits as a check on power. So as we proceed with today's discussion, I think we should also bear in mind questions around how we build support for compliance, not only focusing on whether term limits as a condition are inherent in constitutions. Equally, I encourage the panelists that will come in this panel to also touch on what can broadly be framed as a democratic regression on the continent, as well as the rise of what has been termed electoralism, which is the regular holding of farcical elections to give a veneer of democracy, but whose outcomes merely entrench power held by incumbents rather than giving effect to the will of the people. So I encourage all of you as participants to note all of the questions and comments that you have in the comment section so that the panel can consider them when we have our discussion. Unfortunately, you won't be able to pose live questions, as I'm sure has been shared with you, but we eagerly look forward to your engagements during the Q&A, which will come after the presentation. I have no doubt that the experience and expertise that we have around this virtual table will ensure a most vibrant engagement. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. His name is Dr. Boniface Dulani. He's Director of Surveys for Afrobarometer, as well as Senior Lecturer in Political Science at the University of Malawi. Bonnie, as a lot of us know him, a lot of us who work with him, holds a PhD in Comparative Politics with a minor in International Relations from the Michigan State University. As Director of Surveys, he oversees survey activities in 36 countries, and he is based in Malawi, focusing on democracy and governance, presidential term limits, political economy, public health, as well as the participation of women and youth in politics. Over to you, Bonnie.
Thank you, Itumile. Thank you, Itumile, for that introduction. It's a pleasure, I think, to be on this panel. I just wanted to highlight a couple of issues about the presidential term limits. As it was observed, I think, in the previous presentation, these institutions have increasingly become a major political issue on the African continent as several leaders seek to find ways to circumvent them. We've seen presidents either seeking to amend the constitutions to remove term limits completely or increase the number of maximum terms that they can serve. At times, we've also seen the presidency handpick successors, either their brothers, their sons, and sometimes also just see, clinging on to power without amending term limits or bringing in, anointed successors. Oftentimes, the presidents that have sought to remove term limits have made the argument that their campaigns related to remove term limits are grassroots driven, and that they are a response to popular demand from the ground. However, the evidence that we have adduced from the Afrobarometer surveys over the years suggests that these claims that the term limits the attempts to remove term limits are a response to grassroots popular demands really are not well founded, because the evidence shows that across the continent, support for term limits remains very strong. Starting from 2008, when the Afrobarometer started collecting data on presidential term limits, support has averaged around 76%. So 3/4 of the citizens across the continent really are supportive of term limits. And we see this support really transcend across age differences. So both the young and the old are equally supportive of term limits. Poor people as well as non-poor people, they're just as equally supportive. If we see any differences, perhaps it's in terms of locality, where urban citizens on the continent tend to be slightly more supportive of presidential term limits than rural folk, of a difference of about plus or minus 5 percentage points. But even then, despite this slight difference, both sets of people are very supportive of term limits. We also see, I think, support for term limits being quite high, especially among the educated citizens of the continent, especially those with a postgraduate education. Interestingly, it's also interesting to see that support for term limits is actually high, even in the countries that have attempted to remove them or succeeded in removing term limits. Recently, for instance, we know that in Cote d'Ivoire, the president, I think, was inaugurated yesterday for a third term in office. But even there, support for presidential term limits, according to our most recent survey data that we did towards the end of 2019 in Cote d'Ivoire, we see that 78%, so almost 8 in 10 citizens in Cote d'Ivoire expressing support for presidential term limits. And this applies across the continent, even in countries that we had in the preceding presentation. In Uganda, for instance, support for presidential term limits also is about 3/4. In Gabon, 92%, so almost 9 in 10 Gabonese citizens supporting presidential term limits. And we see the same in Togo, in Burkina Faso, and more countries, just to mention but a few. Of course, there's also the issue of the impact of presidential term limits on development as well as on politics. Of course, when one goes back to the origins of presidential term limits, because they do have quite a long history, going back to classical Greece and Rome. Term limits were really introduced as first and foremost, as a tool to prevent tyranny and authoritarian rule. So it was a key tool, as a key instrument that is there in the defense of democracy. And we've seen countries that have used that apply term limits. By and large, I think their citizens tended to be more supportive of democracy, and also they rate their democracies as performing well. Of course, term limits have also a developmental governance impact. Again, because term limits by their very nature encourage alternation of leadership. So this also leads to alternation of new ideas to resolving national development challenges and problems. And again, the example of Uganda that was given, I think, earlier in the previous presentation, one recalls, I think, when President Museveni came into power in 1986, in his inaugural speech, he made the statement that one of the biggest problems, in Africa that explains our development challenges is leaders who stay on in power for too long. And at that time, he committed to remain in power for 3 years. Of course, as you just heard, he's still in power, almost 30 something years later. So perhaps the counting of the 3 years there is different from the way it's counted. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on the issue of youth and politics and the impact of these attempts to remove term limits. Of course, we've seen demonstrations, street demonstrations and protests in countries where term limits, there have been attempts to remove term limits. And at the forefront of these demonstrations have been the youth. And as already pointed out, the youth are among the leading supporters of presidential term limits. So it's not surprising that when there have been attempts to circumvent the term limits, the youth are at the forefront of challenging such attempts, which is, again, not surprising because Africa has a predominantly youthful population, and yet the average age of the African president and African leader
Hi, Bonnie.
African citizens largely office for too long, and not surprisingly, yes.
Sorry,
Yes.
you're back. We had just lost you for a second, but you're good. Please continue.
Okay, thank you, my connection. So I was saying that the youth, of course, yes, am I still not clear? Okay, thanks. Looks like I'm jammed though on my end because I see your thumbs up, but it's just stuck. So perhaps I should stop here and then maybe someone else can come in and then I can weigh in later.
Thanks, Bonnie. You might want to just complete your thought about the youth. I think that's an interesting potentially segue into the next presentation. Okay, no problem. I think Bonnie is having some connectivity issues, so while he tries to sort that out, we'll move straight on to the second speaker. Now, we're joined by the only woman panelist on this panel right now, Her Excellency Dr. Aminata Toure. I believe that she will be giving her delivery in French, so please use the interpretation function if you need an English translation. Her Excellency Dr. Aminata Toure served as the Prime Minister of Senegal from September of 2013 to July of 2014. Prior to this, she served as the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, where she battled corruption and worked to promote human rights. From 1996 to 2012, she worked with the United Nations Population Fund in various roles, including as a senior advisor at the headquarters in New York, as well as director of the Gender and Human Rights World Department. From May 2019 to October 2020, she served as chair of the Economic, Social, and Environmental Council of Senegal. She holds a master's degree in economics, an MBA, as well as a PhD in international business administration and finances from the International School of Management in Paris. I'm sure you'll all join me in welcoming Dr. Toure, and I'm sure that with all of her experience, she'll be sharing some good insights with us. Dr. Toure?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to, first of all, thank NDI and all the different organizations that are participating in this very important discussion. I would like to, first of all, note a very important figure that one of my predecessor or one of the other panelists just mentioned, and that was the Afrobarometer study that revealed that roughly 75% of African citizens support presidential term limits. This is a key statistic that forms the backdrop for our discussions. 75% of African citizens support presidential term limits. Now, if democracy were indeed the predominance of the majority, that would be enough to close this debate in reality, to end the debate. But the question really is to understand why African citizens prefer to limit the number of terms available to the men and women they choose as leaders. That's really the question we need to examine. And it must be said, and this is important to note, that today, out of the 55 member states of the African Union, 35 countries have a term limit clause. So the majority of African countries do have constitutions that clearly stipulate that terms should be limited. Now, countries, through their people, choose their constitutions. That's also important to note. So the issue of term limits must be analyzed in light of the constitutional choices of countries. I will thus focus my remarks on the case of Senegal, which is my country, following the constitutional choices made during the referendum of March 20th, 2016. And on this occasion, as I'm sure you are aware, Senegal amended its constitution, limiting presidential terms to 2 consecutive mandates and specifying in its first article a very important stipulation that was very much wanted at the time, and I quote, "The term of office of the President of the Republic is 5 years." And then the following sentence is, "No one can exercise more than 2 consecutive terms." Our current president, President Macky Sall, was reelected on February 24th, 2019, and he has repeatedly stated that he will serve his second and last term. And the last time he said this was in a speech on December 31st, 2018. So in Senegal, the issue is behind us, as I've already said on various occasions. This is really no longer an issue in Senegal. What we see on the continent and elsewhere is that people want constitutions to be upheld. This is what guarantees the stability of a country. This is what is expected by the African population, of which 70% rather, is under 35 years old. Now, this is an important figure to remember. As the panelist before me just said, he was talking about youth and wasn't able to say everything he wanted to say, but this is an important issue. Africa has a very young population. We also should look at all the many success stories on this subject. And I think we must do this in order to encourage these success stories. In West Africa, we have many examples, the recent examples of Niger, Mauritania, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cape Verde, among other cases which are to be applauded. We can also say that since 1990, it should be noted that 21 leaders have wisely chosen to leave power in 14 African countries thanks to term limit provisions. This is important to note. And this also proves that there can be a peaceful life after presidency. Limiting terms in office, in my opinion, is an important means of facilitating the transfer of power in Africa. Upholding these limits is also nowadays a way to leave power with honor. This is important to note as well. Let's look first at the benefits of respecting term limits. Some of these advantages are that term limits allow for political transitions at regular and predictable intervals. As a result, rival parties and candidates really have little reason to resort to backdoor means to overthrow the system through violent protest, civil disobedience, and other forms of manifestation of public discontent. And then the leaders also feel more motivated to produce results so that they can leave behind a positive legacy for their successor, and or to simply make history and to go down into the history books of their country, history with a capital H. Term limits also allow leadership renewal. And we talked about youth in the continent. So this allows us to encourage the rise of another generation of political leaders. And it allows also for us to bring in new blood and for the possibility of making policy changes. Now we can see what the risks are, the risks of not upholding term limits. They are, first of all, the temptation to manipulate elections, also the As a consequence, this weakens the authority of other state powers. The first speaker mentioned this, I believe. It also is the marginalization of political opponents. And in the case of term limits, these political opponents would be more inclined to honor their predecessors if we had term limits, if power was handed over, transferred as it was supposed to be, as provided for in the Constitution. Failure to uphold term limits produces, as we all know, and we've seen this, produces strong social tensions with serious economic and social repercussions. Whereas the consolidation of developmental gains in Africa require lasting peace and social stability. If we're going to really be able to uphold the promises of development, we need to have this peace and social stability. There is equally the risk that security forces will intervene in the political game in the event of political tension or deadlock, which can paralyze a country, whereas Africa must definitively put an end to coup d'etat. We've seen this. We've seen it throughout the history of the continent. If we don't uphold mandates or limits, or if we have unlimited term limits, this always ends badly. And generally it ends with a coup d'etat, which just tends to delay progress even further in Africa. Now, what can civil society and citizen movements do to promote term limits? The role of civil society and citizen movements is to continue to work on awakening citizens, promoting awareness, especially among young people and women, and also to help them to organize. And this outreach work needs to be done in national languages. I would remind you that young people and women represent 80% of the electorate together. Access to information and the development of the ability of youth to be able to self-organize outside of partisan halls, because most of the young people are not necessarily members of parties. They're in professional associations, athletic associations, and so forth. And so helping them to self-organize is also a major issue for strengthening democracy in Africa. Because ultimately, it is the citizens who are the major actors of change, and they are also the ones who will be promoting the status quo. So civil society must also continue in its role of political regulation and must do so, or helping to support political regulation, by remaining engaged in advocacy and dialogue with state authorities and with all actors in economic and social life in order to ensure that the Constitution is upheld and democratic gains are safeguarded. In short, term limits are part of strengthening democratic institutions and processes. These limits ensure social stability, which the continent needs so badly in order to consolidate its development. It can ensure we cannot have development in instability. Term limits can also ensure an honorable and peaceful exit for the leaders in office while promoting the arrival of new generations and new leaders in power, in particularly in the continent, across the continent, which, as I said, has a large youth population. As I said at the beginning, 75% under 35. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Toure, and I'm glad that you gave us a taste of what's to come at tomorrow's panel, because tomorrow we'll be discussing how do we build popular support for term limits. And I think your intervention around the role of civil society as a political regulator will be discussed further tomorrow, so thank you for that. Joining us now is Mr. Arnold Tsunga, who is the country director for NDI Zimbabwe. He's a lawyer and a human rights defender with more than 30 years of experience and expertise in law, politics, public administration, and policy, as well as governance, human rights, and the rule of law. Before joining NDI, he served as the Africa Director for the International Commission of Jurists, based in South Africa for 12 years. Mr. Tsunga also was founding executive director of the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights and a past executive secretary of the Law Society of Zimbabwe. Mr. Tsunga holds a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Law honors degree from the University of Zimbabwe. Some of us also know Mr. Tsunga in his role as a human rights defender and supporting the Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Network. So I think all of us are in good hands. Arnold, over to you.
Thank you, Iqubile. Thank you very much. And I wish to extend my thanks to the organizers and my organization, the NDI, and participating entities in creating this very important opportunity, and yourself for the warm introduction, Iqubile. So I wanted to introduce my debate by putting the question of why term limits matter within the context of the governance, architecture and governance requirements of the African Union, because Africa has grappled with good governance, respect for human rights and the rule of law for a long time. And this is both during the pre and the post-independence periods. The Constitutive Act of the African Union itself is quite explicit on this historical reality, in that in its preamble, it makes quite express provisions that conflicts have been a major impediment to the socio-economic development of our continent. And it also reaffirms the need to promote, protect human and people's rights, to consolidate democratic institutions and culture, and to ensure good governance, human rights and the rule of law. It stipulates in the Constitutive Act as both an objective, a value, and as well as a principle of the African Union. So listening to colleagues who have spoken, especially linking the failure of democratic development and the socio-economic negative impact that has on our continent, as well as the various conflicts that are then given birth to as a result of the fact that people didn't have proper facilities at which they can be able to, or framework at which they can be able to speak to power and challenge leaders for unaccountable governance. So that's why I think the question and the argument on term limits, I totally agree with it. But I need to be able to say that at the outset, in my opinion, the presidential term limits by themselves do not produce or result in good leaders or good governance. What they do is that they give societies a chance to peacefully break from bad leadership and bad past practices and try new leaders, and hope that through frequent changing of leaders, there can also be increased prospects for our countries to ultimately have good leaders who can then be responsible in terms of Africa's developmental agenda. For societies to break from bad leadership, I think term limits are necessary. But I must hasten to say that whilst term limits are necessary, they are not sufficient. When you look at the anchor statement I made, that you need Africa that is that respects human rights, rule of law, and good governance. So we need term limits plus. And what is it in the plus that you need for you to be able to get term limits to achieve the desired results of improving Africa's governance and creating a basis where we can have good development and unlock the potential of African citizens to pursue the best in themselves? So I think we need term limits that are supported by strong, independent and impartial institutions of democracy and accountability. You need strong, independent, impartial institutions of protection of human and people's rights. You need strong pro-human rights constitutional and legislative frameworks, and a slavish adherence to this principle so that we can achieve constitutionalism, which essentially means that you move away from having good human rights standards, good constitutions, to having good constitutions plus practices that harmonize the administrative policy and practices with the constitutions. And above all, we need regular, free, fair, credible, and genuine elections as the vehicle through which the regular and genuine change of leaderships can happen in Africa. But I must also warn that one of the things that is missed from the current presentations is that I think the interest in Africa's elections by entities and by people of bad faith is also increasing. And it increases to a point where it undermines the impact, the positive impact that would arise from term limits, as well as contribution of term limits to democratic and developmental succession in African states. So you find that we have some very powerful non-state actors and a lot of growing impact of illiberal influences that is increasingly impacting on the quality of our democracy and on the quality of leaders. And therefore, the term limits, whilst they really unlock a potential, I think we also need corresponding programs that deal with the emergence of powerful non-state actors and the increasing impact of illiberal influences that has the effect of undermining democracy and building momentum for authoritarian consolidation, for democratic regression, as well as for increase in the number of non-state actors who have a very strong interest in Africa's elections, to a point where I think we need programming that can measure the impact and how to deal with the impact of the involvement of non-state actors who then instrumentalize some of our leaders and create a perception that there is a political context when in fact there may be geoeconomic, geopolitical contexts and leaders who are actually essentially being imposed on African citizens. So I think if I get another opportunity to speak, I've been asked to speak about a bit more on Zimbabwe and Zambia and the impact on term limits in those countries. And as we all know that both Zimbabwe and Zambia had long-term leaders before, Kaunda in Zambia and Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And both countries at some point in their political lives made a decision to introduce term limits. Zambia's experiment has been much better in that since 1996, when the constitution was amended to introduce presidential limits, we have had a change in government with three parties, UNIP, MMD, and the PF, being able to get new leaders emerging. I think out of about 8 elections that have taken place. So I think in terms of the developmental agenda of ticking boxes, you can actually say that the constitutional amendment that introduced term limits from a quantifiable perspective has introduced a number of leaders, and that in itself I think is a positive development in Zambia. But we do have a concern now with the incumbency in Zambia, where there is a sense in which there is a huge attack on civic space, on legitimate political opponents, as well as on human rights defenders. And one of the characteristics that has been really problematic, which I think people need to look at, is the emergence of militias that are called cadres, who seem to be taking over the security and policing responsibilities in some areas in order to create a climate of fear and a climate that in fact prevents a situation where Zambia can go through proper elections in 2021. And in concluding on Zimbabwe, the 2013 constitution indeed introduced term limits. And unfortunately, this was after Mugabe had stayed in power for close to 37 years. And he had actually to be removed as a result of a popular coup. But unfortunately, Mugabeism as a system of oppression and repression has not been dismantled. If anything, Mugabe had become a weak link. And once he was taken out, the system of repression, closure of civic space, undermining of the legitimate opposition, and the proximity between the security sector, political power, and economic opportunity makes it very difficult for the country to unlock itself from this vice grip that is currently there. So the longevity, finally, the longevity of President Mugabe, it introduces something, the when you look at an executive who has got long years in office versus other branches of government like the judiciary or the legislature, where there's regular change as a result of the fact that the parliament, there are terms of office, but at the same time with the judiciary, there's always been a change in judicial leadership. So the permanency of the executive in Zimbabwe, just like what is happening in Swaziland or Eswatini now, where you have a king whose enduring presence makes other institutions of governance a dwarf. And as a result, the political culture of the country then is represented by the long-term leader. And I think those are things that the third term can dismantle. Let me end there for my introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Arnold. And in particular, there are 2 points that you raised that haven't been raised that I'd like us to take forward in the Q&A and the discussion. And that is the foreign interests at play in African elections, which also takes us into a conversation around political party funding, which is front and center when it comes to a democratization, as well as the question around the instrumentalization of youth who are disaffected, who are unemployed, who are poor, and the use of that poverty and that disaffection for political violence. And I think that also has a very immediate and adverse impact on the democratic project, but more on that later. For now, I'd like to introduce our fourth and final speaker, another man, Dr. Edem Abebe. Dr. Edem Abebe is an executive committee member of the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers and a member of the advisory board of the International Journal of Constitutional Law. He previously served as a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and the Rule of Law. He has also been recognized as an extraordinary lecturer at the University of Pretoria, just up the road from me. So with that, I'd like you, Dr. Abebe, to come in.
Thank you very much, Kumule. And I want to thank the, can you hear me? I want to thank the organizers on behalf of the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers, and on behalf of myself, of course. And the challenge when you have 3 marvelous presenters before you coming is wondering what added value can I bring in. Bonnie started with presenting the hard facts about the fact that term limits are popular, that everybody wants them. And Dr. Toure so eloquently presented the consequences of failing to respect term limits. I don't think I can add anything much on it. And Arnold came in and indicated that we have to look beyond term limits. Now, this is the framework that the 3 panelists have already built. Now, what I want to try and do is connect these 3 core messages with the normative fundamental idea at the African level, what the African Union calls the African values. I think there's no question that today, even in countries where term limits don't exist, and even in countries where presidents have been in power for decades, there is an understanding that the only game in town, at least rhetorically, is accountable, responsive, honest, and at the same time, limited government. So you want to have a government that is empowered, but also limited and democratic. That's the first one. And the second one is also from borrowing from the facts that the significant majority of the people across the continent support term limits. Now, these ideals coexist with 2 other hard facts. The first one is what I call winner-takes-all politics. So we have a political system where whoever wins, whether by hook or by crook, gets absolute dominance over political positions, over economic positions, essentially over the distribution of rent. So that's the reality. And the second reality and flows from it is personalization of politics. Now, term limits are essentially a reflection of these 2 fundamental challenges in our politics. So we have the recognition of term limits, the popularity of limits, but they coexist with these 2 factors. Now, what can term limits do in addressing these problems? And you cannot have term limits work without addressing these 2 problems. And if you look at how, especially in the context of countries that evade term limits are argued as something that undermine democracy, that limits the popular desire to choose whoever the leaders should be. But in reality, what term limits do is reset the playing field regularly. We know that whenever incumbents run, even in countries where the political system is established, where the political system is competitive, incumbents have an age, even in those countries. So you can imagine in countries where in the context of personalized politics and winner-takes-all politics, you can see that it's hard to achieve democracy, to achieve a level playing electoral field without a regular exclusion, if you will, of incumbents. Now, the longer one leader continues, and this is something that I want to link to what Dr. Aminata spoke about, it leads to the hollowing out of political parties, of parliaments, of the judiciary. It's essentially, the institutions become the shells, mere shells that is exercise absolutely very limited control and oversight over the presidency. So that is the fundamental erosive, corrosive impact of the violation of term limits. I think there's something that I want to add into the list of consequences, and that's the psychological aspect. When you see a single president, a single person at the helm of politics for so long, it kind of creates a social political status. It undermines the dynamism that any society needs. So you need to be stable, but also you need to be dynamic for the economy, but also for cultural innovation and growth. And you cannot have that without term limits. And of course, one thing that is critical for any society is confidence in institutions, but also the confidence of the institutions. You need to have a security sector. You need to have a judiciary. You need to have a bureaucracy that people trust, but also is confidence of itself. And if it depends for its existence, for its rents on a single individual, that is undermined. And if you don't have institutions that people have confidence in and are confident of themselves, that essentially leads to corruption, that the socially corrosive impact that it comes with. Now, I mean, I wanna end with a slightly positive note, and that's the fact that today the absence of term limits is the exception across the world, across Africa, but also broadly across the world. Now, but we also at the same time understand that throughout our history, the existence of term limits have only made presidents, incumbents, very creative in terms of how they want to choose to undermine them. So we need to think about what is important, and this is the last question that was raised for us to address. What can scholars, constitutional experts do? And as Dr. Aminata and also Arnold and Bonnie spoke, the fundamentally democracy is about the people. But if you look at the question, there's no question about popular support for term limits. So I want to frame term limits as an elite problem. They are an elite problem. And if we want to solve the challenge they pose, whether it's their violation or the absence of respect, we need to address it as such. It is a problem that fundamentally is an elite problem. And that's where I think we need to start addressing, particularly strengthening, but also democratizing political parties. If you see the countries where attempts at change were defeated, for instance, in Nigeria, or even in countries where incumbents still had to keep term limits, like Mauritania and Burundi, you'll see that the key constraint came not from the people, but from their political parties. So I think it's important to start strengthening political institutions, particularly political parties, including the political party of the presidents, so that they can stand up to them. So I think understanding term limits as an elite problem rather than as a popular problem will help us addressing the key issues. I mean, I'm not underestimating, obviously, the importance of the people. I think what happened in 2014 in Burkina Faso is a recent example of what an organized, popular group with a red line of term limits can do. But at the same time, we need to recognize the importance of elites. And ultimately as well, democracy is not so much about the winners, it's about what is called the confidence of the losers. You need to have you need to have losers that accept defeat. So you cannot imagine democracy without the consent of the losers. And you cannot have the losers consenting to a system of government if there's an incumbent that consistently undermines, that consistently finds a way around electoral rules. And I want to borrow, he sent it in a written text, but he didn't say it during the presentation, but I want to borrow from Arnold and finish there. What is important for democracy is what he calls procedural uncertainty, but outcome certainty. And if you cannot have term limits, it's very difficult to imagine a situation, and there is evidence in the African context where outcomes are not certain. I'll stop there, and I'll be very happy to take any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Abebe. Really, really interesting perspectives that you've shared, and I think quite different from the other panelists. Maybe the good place to start as we kick off the discussion is your second to last point around the centrality of political parties in defending against unbridled power. And the question really there is, in a context where more than 75% of Africans are young, and if you take it to 80%, then it's youth and women, right? So in a future that is young, and where young people are voting with their feet, they're not joining political parties. Many of them aren't voting because they're not reaping the rewards that democracy promised them. Is it still relevant to center political parties as key agents for defending democracy?
Should I start already, or how do you propose we proceed?
Please go ahead. I'll intervene, and then I'll ask the panelists to come in.
No, thank you very much. I think it's a fundamental, again, it's one of the contradictions of our continent. You have more than 70%, and in every country without exception, composed of the youth, and you have a political class that's fundamentally not young, to put it mildly. And that kind of creates a form of intergenerational injustice, right? Those that are affected by the decisions have very limited role in the process and substance of those decisions. At the same time, I think, as you know, if we recognize democracy as an organized, fair competition, you cannot imagine it without political parties. So the question is not whether we should center competition in political parties, but whether and how to bring the youth. How can we bring the youth into the center of political parties? I think that's the key. And of course, you know, with things getting slightly better, and I don't want to generalize yet, but if you look at countries where there is better democratic competition, the youth have better influence than in other more authoritarian countries. So I think as things open up, and this is also, I guess, the challenge of our time, as young people everywhere, we need to organize ourselves, make the youth part of the agenda, part of the decision-making process. So just to summarize, essentially, the question is not so much whether political parties should be the center of political organization. I think there's no other way, but how can we bring the youth into the center of these institutions?
Okay. Thank you so much. I'd like now to go to a couple of comments and questions that are coming in from our participants across the continent. And I think the first one is really just sharing a perspective with us. And it reads, in my country, which is Chad, the President of the Republic has been in power since 1980. He is presented as the guarantor of the stability of our country and the sub-region because of his readiness to send armed forces into the battlefield to fight terrorism. In 2018, he had changed the term limits. Sorry, in 2018, he had the constitution amended following a so-called inclusive national forum. We've seen those in many places, where he changed term limits and lengthened the term of office. In December 2020, he promulgated a new constitution following a second forum, all with the support of a parliament whose term of office expired in 2015. It is now planned that the forums will now be every 3 years, and the possibility cannot be ruled out that these periodic forums will each time lead to a constitutional amendment. Is this a case of a country with no term limit? I think that's a very interesting question that's posed at the end, because it also speaks to processes that are instituted at the national level and even at local levels to pretend to consult with voters, with the general public, and yet the outcome is already decided. So maybe Dr. Aminata can take a reflection on this for us, but only after I've read the other two questions. The second one is, do you think that even if term limits are known, leaders will be able to respect them? And the poser of this question takes the case of Côte d'Ivoire. When it took the coup d'etat of 1999 to remove Bedi from power, General Guel Roberts, who wanted to ensure the transition, was trying to run for office. For President Gbagbo Laurent, it took a rebellion to remove him. Today, President Ouattara has run for a third term by changing the constitution. The problem is not in this participant's opinion, in the knowledge of the limitation of term of office. So this participant is asking, does the fact that presidents know about term limits guarantee that they will respect them? And I think for this, I'd like Arnold to take this for us. Then the third question, before I allow panelists to come in. Thanks for conducting an insightful discussion. What matters most, the terms or the democratization of the election? Is it unrealistic to discuss the term limits while having undemocratic elections? Because some countries have no constitutional term of limit, but conduct periodic elections which are mostly unfair and undemocratic in its process, while election during the election and during the counting of the votes. For example, Ethiopian constitution does not put definite term limit of the prime minister. In this case, I believe the most important thing is a free, fair, and democratic election, not the term. And I think this is a very important question as well, because earlier on, Arnold mentioned the term limits plus outlook. And I think what the participant is asking, should we really be focusing on term limits, or should we be focusing on the system in its entirety? And I think for this question, just a second. For this question, I'd like Boniface to help us. So over to you, panelists, starting with Arnold, then Dr. Toure, then Dr. Dulani. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. And the issue of the mismatch between policy, like between law standards that have been agreed, such as term limits, which are constitutional standards, and practices, I think it is at the center of the failure of our continent to adhere to good governance, human rights observation, and the rule of law, because the primary responsibility for implementing these agreed positions around term limits, they lie with the state, and there is a weight of responsibility on the head of state to ensure that the conduct of state business is in accordance with both the letter and the spirit of the law. So what happened in Ivory Coast, and I think it's Guinea, Conakry as well, and I thought, Madam Moderator, with respect, Aminata would have been very useful for this one, because of the fact that West Africa is sort of departed from a value that was beginning to be associated with West Africa in terms of defending the democratic rights, the political rights of the citizens of countries in West Africa, and enforcing their democratic decisions, given what happened in the Gambia, where the incumbency, after losing elections, tried to retain power despite losing elections, and Senegal, where Madam Aminata Toure is coming from, were at the forefront of using assets, military assets, to enforce the democratic will as expressed by people in the Gambia. So now the developments in Ivory Coast and the Guinea Conakry, they are slightly different in that the manipulation of the constitution with, I think, a cloak of judicial authority happened before the elections. But in essence, it brought about a significant amount of discohesion within the ECOWAS community. But then, for some reason, they failed to go beyond doing what they've generally been traditionally known for in terms of enforcing the democratic principles that are enshrined in the treaties, but also in the national constitutions. But I think it's the problem that the court system was manipulated or undermined in a way that President Ouattara appeared to be authorized by the jurisdiction of the courts in his countries. But otherwise, I think what it means is that he has now created a long-term structural problem that might result in conflict returning to Ivory Coast. So it was an unwise decision, and he has invested potentially in a crisis for the whole region. So that's what I would say. There was a point, I don't know whether it's okay for me, which Dr. Abebe raised on the elite cohesion.
Please go ahead.
Yes. So yeah, I was very interested in that point, that the opportunities for change in societies sometimes arise less as a result of the agitation by the ordinary people, but more maybe as a result of the disagreements and lack of cohesion at the elite level. And it is true. And unless it's a revolution, where the overthrow of a regime arises as a result of a revolutionary process where there's people power, like what happened possibly in Malawi and also what happened in Sudan. But in countries like Zimbabwe, where there is serious disagreement at the elite level, the lesson I learned from there is that, yes, the consensus and discohesion at the elite level creates an opportunity for change. But if it's not properly taken advantage of through leadership in terms of, civil society leadership, political leadership, but also sub-regional leadership, the opportunity is for change rather than transformation of societies. So in Zimbabwe, we ended up seeing that disagreements within the political leadership in ZANU-PF and with the military resulted in change, but that change was removal of a long-term dictator and replacement of that long-term dictator with a manipulative process that resulted in what essentially is a quasi-military regime. So I agree, but then we need to be able to focus on saying, is this a change opportunity or a transformation opportunity? Back to you, moderator.
Excellent. Your reflections, Dr. Toure, and please feel free to address any of the comments that have been raised. You don't have to stick to the area that I suggested for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to say that I don't entirely agree with Adema. I think that the question of term limits is not just a question of elites. I think it's a societal issue. And we can look at Senegal and what happened in 2012 as proof. In 2012, the Constitutional Court authorized the president in power to run for a third term. But it was the electors, the voters actually, who resolved the issue, who decided the question. It was the electors who put an end to that debate. And in 2016, and I come back to that, that's why we saw that the Constitution was amended by the current president, President Macky Sall, who said very clearly that there will be only 2 5-year terms and that you cannot have more than 2 consecutive terms. This is very clearly stated in the Constitution now. So the question can be an elite question, but I think it's also the citizens and the voters who actually really answer this question or resolve it. So I think that the work that needs to be done is work to continue to raise awareness among youth and women. As I was saying, democracy is carried by the voters, by the population themselves. Even if sometimes it's expressed through the elites, I think that I remain convinced that it's coming through the youth and the voters. And then another aspect is that democracy is not only limited to term limits. You can have a whole succession of bad presidents, but you also have to look at having transparent electoral processes. It's a matter of having participation by the citizens. They have to have a choice. They have to come out and vote. You have to have turnout. You also have to have citizens who are aware and educated and who know what the leaders are trying to implement and what their programs are and platforms. So this is also work that needs to be done with respect to the voters. I think that's also important. And then also, as I said, with the youth, our moderator was talking about all the youth who have sometimes gotten involved in political violence, but it is also youth who will be solving this issue, resolving the question, such as in 2012 in Senegal. I think that's very important that the Senegalese youth really mobilized and came out in large numbers to impose these term limits through the vote. And I think these are the tendencies that we need to reinforce in Africa. African democracy is going to be expressed through its youth. If you have a 75% youth on the continent, you can't have a transformation unless the youth is really on the front lines. They have to be able to participate in all aspects of political life. And often, as Adam was saying, we have party leaders and other political leaders who are older and don't represent the majority, but we have to look at how youth can be involved. Youth has to be a central issue in democracy for Africa. And term limits, of course, is also very important, because men are not gods. We don't have any people who are gods that can stay in power forever. We have to have constitutions that have limits, and we have to have institutions that have solidarity. And in these institutions, women and men all have to be able to participate. And I think that this is a matter of strengthening citizens' political abilities, young people, as I said, but also women. Because, as I said, together, women and young people represent 80% of the electorate, but also they're the most marginalized, the ones that have fewer access to resources and who participate less in politics because of this. So in terms of resources, and we have to also make sure that they have the ability to participate. So we have to focus really on how we can strengthen the capacities of our citizens and our youth people to be more involved in politics, and this in addition to term limits, because even if we have a constitution that has term limits, it's the voters who are going to decide at the end of the day. And so for all these issues, we need to really make sure that these are of top concern, top priority for everybody who wants to see democracy promoted on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Toure. And really what I'm getting from your final remarks is the importance for us to galvanize activism and to support citizen engagement in political as well as democratic processes, because that is the cornerstone of how we safeguard our democracies across the continent. Mr. Dulani, Dr. Dulani, could you come in with your reflections on the first round of questions? And as you think through that, help us also understand, in the cases in your surveys where people have not supported term limits, what have been the reasons? Because we also need to understand that perspective in the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Moderator, for this opportunity again. The question that I wanted to zero in on was the one that asks whether we need better elections rather than presidential term limits. Of course, in the ideal world, you would want to have good electoral systems that ensure that the will of voters translates into the selection of leaders. But of course, good elections depend quite a great deal on who manages those elections, and usually that tends to be incumbents. when you have an incumbent who is also contesting for an election, they have, of course, an interest also in ensuring that the election brings out a result that favors them. That's why you see that oftentimes we have this notion of incumbency advantage, where leaders who are in power rarely lose. So, of course, having good electoral systems can help, but you might end up with the same leaders staying on over and over again. And we've heard this argument actually come from presidents who are opposed to presidential term limits. They argue that term limits are actually taking away the power to choose leaders from the voters into the constitutions, that let the people decide. If a president is doing a good job, they will return them, and if they're doing a poor job, they will vote them out. And of course, as I pointed out, we have this high support for presidential term limits. But what is also mind-boggling at times is that when an incumbent, even in a country where majorities want presidential term limits, they stand and they get around the term limits, stand for office, they still sometimes end up winning elections. That shows you, I think, that either there are problems with the elections or the level of popular commitment to presidential term limits does not always translate into voting out incumbents. As I said, I'm also a student of history, and going back again to the history and origins of presidential term limits, these arguments have been made before that term limits are anti-democratic. During the discussion, the debates over the US Constitution, these debates also came up. On one hand, you had James Madison that argued passionately in favor of presidential term limits. But then on the other hand, had Thomas Jefferson who said, no, we don't want the term limits. Let the people make their decisions, and then we have results that reflect the will of voters. Of course, over time, if someone is in office for too long, that increases the likelihood that they will start manipulating the election results, and then making sure that those results will work in their favor. So we had the question about Chad, for example, where President Dabe has been in power, I think, since 1981. Initially, the country adopted term limits, and then when President Dabe realized that the end of his 2 terms was coming to an end, he went and removed the term limits from the Constitution. And since then, there have been these kind of regular reviews of the Constitution that the person who posed the question alluded to. That just highlights why term limits are important. Because when you have presidential term limits, voter turnout also tends to be affected. See, voters will show up in an election when they think that there's a higher likelihood that there is going to be political change. But if the same person is likely to win, then people will vote.
Dr. Dulani, we've lost you again. Dr. Dulani? Okay, so I think we'll move on to the second round of questions. We're doing very well for time, and I think this is really the meat of why we're all in this session, is to get the discussion flowing. Dr. Dulani, I see you're back, so I'm going to call on you for the second round of questions. But I think your final point was a very interesting one around the relationship between term limits and voter turnout. And I think the point you were making was that people will show up in an election that they think might give outcomes that reflect their will, rather than a process that is rigged in favor of one party or another. And I think that's a really interesting area that we hadn't canvassed earlier. I'm going to go back to the questions that are coming from the participants, and I'll just democratically decide who is going to address which question. But I think if anybody wants to address other questions, you're more than welcome as well. And this is to panelists. So the first area is, again, a question around youth. And it's really sad that we couldn't get a young person on the panel, because we seem to be talking quite a lot about young people and the role that they have to play in this matter. So I'll ask Dr. Abebe to take this one. It is largely known that African youth are the most marginalized grouping in society. in terms of political participation. So how exactly can term limits enhance the political and economic participation of young Africans? And I know Dr. Toure had started to talk about this, so I'd like Dr. Abebe to also give it a shot. And then this question I'll ask Dr. Toure to take. How can we speak of constitutional term limits when we observe that once in power, governments manage to modify constitutions according to their own desires and convenience? What alternative can civil society organizations, as well as other actors, have bring about a change in the state of affairs beyond the denunciations whose effects only last as long as the flame of a candle? And I think, Dr. Toure, it's relevant that you take this question because you've been talking to us quite a bit around, empowering young people and encouraging their agency and encouraging them to participate in political processes. But I think the question is, it's easier said than done. So what concrete strategies can you help us as we take this conversation forward? Then there's a question that came in from Facebook. And here I'll ask Arnold to take. Is there a relationship between the respect or the disrespect for presidential term limits in regards to those who come into power democratically and those who take power through non-democratic means, for example, a military coup? And you spoke, Arnold, about coups as well, so I think it's quite appropriate that you take this. So basically, what the participant is asking, how does the means in which a leader comes into power impact their relationship with term limits throughout their presidency? Another good question. And then a final question for now, and we'll see how we go with time. We might be running out of time. Just a second. Right. So it's a similar question that I have. Well, it's quite similar, not too similar. And it is, what is the relationship between unconstitutional stays in power and state weakness and fragility? Is there a causal relationship that can be identified to justify practically why we're advocating for term limits when it comes to state fragility and state weakness? And there, I think any of the panelists can take that. So in terms of the order for responses, I'd like Dr. Toure to come first, then Dr. Abebe, then Mr. Tsunga, and then Dr. Dulani, if that's okay. And can we please be as brief as possible? We're fast running out of time. It's been an excellent discussion and debate. Thanks.
Yes, very well. Of course, we could talk about this issue of youth for a long time. But as I was saying before, Africa will be made with its youth. And that at every level, economic, social, but especially political. And I think it's possible to do this because we have seen across the continent a lot of changes that have been brought about essentially by young people. I talked about Senegal in 2012. We can talk about Burkina Faso. So this work is underway, but it's sort of it's something we have to do at the grassroots level, little by little, gradually. We have to also look at the role that the media plays. And I think that the media is playing an important role in democracy, generally speaking, but also raising awareness about term limits. I think we need to go back to this basic work, which is to meet youth where they are in their own organizations. And again, generally speaking, when there is a change, it's the youth that are bringing about this change. And I think that they have a predominant role to play in terms of politics and in change. So I think that this is not, the issue of change is not political parties that are going to bring about this change. And we see this in many countries, that it's actually the youth bringing about the change. And I think we have to really recognize that. And when I talk about youth, I'm talking also about young women as well as young boys, because we have to meet them where they are. They have to be able to organize, and we need to support them in this work. And this is the work of everybody in the civil society, activists, anybody who supports democracy. And I think that nothing can really stand up to 75% of the population. We can't resist 75% of the population. I think they have the power to do this. And that's why we have to help them structure their activities. They are predominant in the demographic category, of course. And so young people are the majority, and we have to give them the resources they need. Of course, we can't, we have to be able to meet them where they are, to help train them to become conscious citizens who can defend their democracy, who can mobilize, and who can vote, of course. I think that the issue of getting the youth vote is essential, and that's where we need to do a lot of work. Young people need to understand that voting is not useless. It's not a useless activity, but it's something they can do, and that voting is really going to help them to change the dynamics in their country. So I think that really the central issue today in our discussion, when we talk about and what we need to think about in terms of civil society, is how can we leverage the strength of young people, and how can we support them? Because for the most part, they're not that involved, and they might be a little bit dormant. Now, in Senegal, we do see young people who prefer to take boats and cross over to Europe, and they cross the ocean by the hundreds. But what can we do to get them to come back and to stay in the country and to become actors of democracy, and also bring about the change that they're looking for? And as I said, I remind you, in 2012, the change was brought about primarily because of youth, but we have to invest in them. We have to invest in our youth, but beyond just political parties. When we talk about politics, there's the monopoly of political parties. Of course, that's not true. Politics affects all of society, and so we have to mobilize everybody and have this alliance between young people and and women. If we have this alliance, there's nothing you could do to resist them. They would be extremely powerful. So I think that that's the work that we have before us. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent, and just so encouraging. Thank you so much, Dr. Toure. Could I ask Dr. Abebe to come in, and then thereafter Mr. Tsunga, and then we'll do the final comments from Dr. Dulani.
Thank you very much. I'll add one quick clarification, and then try and address the question about term limits and fragility. First one, Dr. Toure, thank you very much. What I was trying to say is not that people are important. I think that's fundamental. But we also need to recognize the importance of elites. And I think there's a fundamental challenge we need to address there. One. And secondly, one of the questions was whether the question is about term limits or about free and fair elections. I think it's not whether. Term limits are about free and fair elections. It's very difficult to have an incumbent running regularly and still have free and fair elections. So they're not two things, they're one thing. They are fundamentally about free and fair elections, not a limitation on it. And the question about fragility and term limits, I think if you look at the facts, and I'll come back to a recent study on that, but if you look at the facts, countries that are fragile or authoritarian are unlikely to have term limits, or even if they have it, the chances for going around them, for violating them, are higher. That's the first one. And the second one is, when term limits are violated, they often lead to some kind of social division, lack of dynamism, social tension, and that can then lead to fragility. So it goes both ways. I think the absence of it or the lack of respect for them is a sign of fragility, but also the failure to respect them can in turn generate movements that can destabilize the country. So again, interrelated. And I think there was a recent study, I think the African Center for Strategic Studies, I may have the name slightly wrong, but there is a correlation. The causation is harder to prove, but there is a correlation between countries that respect term limits that tend to be more stable, and countries that either don't have term limits or have had experience of violations where they tend to be more fragile. So again, I think the facts are that term limits encourage democratic competition, but also encourage more stability, which is the basis for economic achievement, for social achievement, and for cultural enrichment.
Excellent point to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Abebe. Arnold, you, and then Bonnie. And then also, can I ask you and Bonnie Arnold to also do some closing remarks, because we're woefully out of time, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Ikwemile. Thanks a lot. And so part of the question on state fragility has been answered by Dr. Abebe, but the outstanding one is about the means of coming to power, and whether that means can then shape the attitude of the leader towards term limits. And I think the answer is yes, because it's very difficult for someone who has come through undemocratic means to then be the champion for democracy. I think in political contestation, in the paper that I'd initially shared, I was saying that a lot of people, and a significant number of leaders have the notion of power as an end in itself, and therefore by any means and at any costs. So elections are normally seen as a danger in terms of the acquisition of power, and then once power is achieved, then that's the end, because that's the end game. And so when elections increasingly become converted to be tools to acquire power rather than frameworks through which people must be allowed to have a democratic expression and a collective way in which leaders can be chosen, I think we need to accept that there is a sense in which elections by some elements have now become instruments through which power has to be acquired. And once it's acquired, then the election don't matter. In fact, there is a process of consolidation, a process of undermining state institutions, a process of undermining participation, in fact, closing in order to consolidate. And this is why I was talking about the illiberal influences. And that's why I was also talking about the non-state actors who finance political campaigns, choose their political leaders that they support, sure that once they're in power, they can then use proximity to acquire economic opportunity and divert governance to achieve personal outcomes. Then on the issue of state fragility and the quality of elections, the NDI currently have just been reflecting and grappling with the question of fragile states and the type of programming that is needed there. But some of the characteristics that we were looking at includes the loss of monopoly, state monopoly over the infrastructure of cohesion, the question of emergence of non-state armed actors, political violence, exploitation of the youth, the way I spoke about in Zambia, the cadres who get deployed to disrupt civil society, human rights defenders, and then where you get non-state actors as governance actors in providing rule of law and security and service delivery. You also have informal networks that undermine the state accountability mechanisms in order to advance discrete political or economic interests. And in those types of societies, you actually begin to see that is where there's a full-blooded conflict in terms of forced migration, internal displacements, as well as economic refugees that pour out of the countries. What Dr. Aminata Toure was talking about, young people being forced to leave Africa and being drowned in the oceans. So what that speaks to is that whilst at the level of aspirations, we need to give young people a real voice and finding mechanisms of making them realize that they are the ones who are actually leaders of today. But the reality is that there's a small minority, small cabals that have captured state power, and that then instrumentalize even through the electoral processes to retain that power. And I think that's what we need to deal with. It explains why majority groups like women will be still marginalized politically, excluded, and not properly involved in leadership positions. It also means the youth. Africa is a young population. The demographic is less than 16 years is the average mean age in Africa. But you see that the mean age, even if they are the majority, but politically, they're not organized enough, they're excluded, they're marginalized. And so I think there is a way in
Comrade,
which...
I'm going to have to ask you to finish up in 30 seconds. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I've actually ended. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. So we'll have Dr. Boni and then final closing remarks in 1 minute each from Dr. Toure and Dr. Abebe. Then I'll come in and just kind of wind us down. I will beg 5 additional minutes from everybody who's joined us just so that we can close it off appropriately. Thanks. Dr. Delani?
Thank you, moderator, and I hope my internet holds up for this last 1 minute. So I just wanted to make a clarification on this question about the relationship between how leaders come into power and the likelihood that they will respect term limits. Actually, we've seen presidents that have come to power democratically still trying to circumvent term limits. So there's really no major difference there. What is different is that leaders with a military background have a higher chances of succeeding in removing term limits than those without a military background. Now, I just wanted to end again by reiterating the point that the term limits have a lot of support across the continent. But leaders on the continent will not just respect term limits simply because they have large popular support. I recall the words of the late Frederick Kitchewa from Zambia. He was a strong advocate for term limits, but once he came into power, he actually made a statement saying that I didn't know that this position is so sweet. So once one is there, they will try and cling on to that position, even if they were advocates for term limits. So that's why civil society and state actors, as the previous speaker said, are important in ensuring that the voices of the people are maintained, are reflected in the choice of leaders. Ultimately, no single individual has a monopoly of wisdom. The leaders that are in power today, even where they've done a good job, they've only done so because they were given an opportunity to be in those positions. So there's really no reason to assume that if they leave office, no one else can do as good, if not a better job as they have. Once again, my thanks, Lily, for giving us this opportunity to bring in the voices of African citizens from the Afrobarometer. So my thanks to you, moderator, to the organizers of the session for giving us this opportunity. I thank you and all my fellow panelists as well for the excellent insights that we have learned through this panel.
Thanks, Doc. Dr. Toure, your 30 seconds starts now.
Yes, of course. If 75% of Africans were against term limits, then I don't know what we would be able to do. But with 75%, if we can transform 75% into votes, then we can mobilize the young and we can have term limits. I think that term limits is part of strengthening democratic institutions and processes. I think that is important. It's important for stability of our continent, which needs to have stability in order to continue making gains in development. And once again, it's an opportunity that we have for incumbent presidents it's an opportunity for them to leave peacefully and to leave honorably.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toure. Dr. Abebe?
No, thank you very much. Again, the fundamental challenge with term limits is that we have to translate what we know is public opinion into public policy that is respected. I think that we need to connect opinion with policy. But having said that, term limits are about access to power and exit from power. They say very little about how power is exercised in between. They're not about the exercise of power. And that's why we have countries with constitutions without constitutionalism, democracies, even in their names, without democracy. So that's broader societal awakening, societal pressure that we need. And I think everybody needs to be a politician, an active politician. And that should be the goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists. I've had a fantastic time in the last 2 hours, and I'm sure everybody who's joined us has also learned a great deal. What I want to do now is just to take a few minutes to kind of maybe just reiterate some of the salient points that came out so that all of us leave the meeting kind of on the same page. Of course, there's more sessions coming tomorrow and the day after. So I would encourage everybody to participate in those sessions as well, because there we're going to be ventilating further some of the issues that have come up. So, and really just to start off, it's clear that there's great support for constitutional term limits. The figure of 75, 76% has been bandied about throughout the session. And so I think there's no doubt that there is great support for this. Now, the question that is posed to us is that how do we translate this opinion into policy? And some of the recommendations that Dr. Toure was giving us around mobilizing and supporting agency will take us some distance in responding to this question. The second thing is term limits are not just changing warm bodies in air-conditioned presidential suites. It allows for an alternation of power as well as an important alternation of ideas, which has a material impact on development and livelihoods. Youth are drivers, and they are resisting the erosion of presidential term limits. Having more than 70% of Africans as young people, this is an energy that we need to tap into and work very hard to mobilize and to translate that resistance into votes. The majority of African countries do have term limits, so there are good stories to tell, and we should be telling those stories and not just decrying the negative examples across the continent. The role of civil society in outreach at the subnational level is very important. We need to reach the grassroots, and we can't just be working in the cities that we're comfortable with. And we need to support self-organizing and movement building to promote support for term limits. And here the buzzwords are agency, people power. But importantly, this has to be underwritten by political conscientization. It can't just be building agency in a vacuum. The next point that I'd like to make is that we must locate the conversation on term limits, Arnold told us, on the AU framework, because the AU does support democracy, it does support good governance and rule of law. And so we already have an entry point. So why is it that we haven't been able to go as far in terms of embedding term limits within AU statutes and policies? The next point is that term limits do not in and of themselves produce good leaders. They provide an opportunity for change and renewal, as I've mentioned already. Institutions of democracy and accountability are necessary for constitutionalism, and free, fair, and credible elections are also a necessary condition. So it's not either or, as Dr. Abebe told us, it's one thing. Let us not forget the role of foreign interests. Arnold reminded us of this very important non-state actor. They fund elections, they have direct interest in who grabs power. And so that is a factor that we always have to be having front and center of our conversations around the democratic project on the African continent. The next point is the instrumentalization of youth disaffection and unemployment. We see this in Zambia, we saw it in Malawi, we saw it in Mozambique, we've seen it in West Africa, we've seen it in Kenya. It's a reality that we have to contend with. So how do we translate that restive energy of young people for something positive rather than youth being instrumentalized for political violence and power grabs? Then I'm almost finished. Dr. Abebe reminded us of the political culture of winner takes all in elections. And if that political culture sustains, then it will be very difficult for us to promote and entrench term limits in our countries. The third last point is it is impossible to achieve a level playing field if incumbents are not excluded from competing sometimes. And I think that is the point that we've been raising throughout this session. The role of the elite, I think this was a raging debate between Dr. Toure as well as Dr. Abebe, and I really enjoyed it. And I think the point is that elites can be powerful actors. They are powerful actors, and in many cases, they are the deciders. And so we cannot forget the role that the elite plays, not that we have to focus on the elite. Similarly, the role of political parties. As much as youth are not joining political parties as they used to in the past, this is where power sits. And so this level of power we have to engage with as well. We can't just leave it on the side and hope that just mobilizing outside of the political space is going to take us forward. And the last point really is a failure to respect term limits contributes to instability and fragility, and the other way around. And I thought this was also a very interesting point that was made right at the end. And I think just to end it off, what I'm taking away, apart from everything that I've said, is a phrase that Arnold used, which is it's term limits plus. It's not just term limits, and we can't do it without term limits either. And the plus indicates all of the necessary safeguards and institutions that buttress democracy, including free and fair elections, including accountability institutions, including young people and everybody showing up to vote, and including an active population that recognizes its people power and uses its voice to support and defend democracy and constitutionalism. So with that, I'd like to thank NDI. I'd like to thank all of the other conference organizers and really the panelists who have been excellent. I've really had a great 2 hours, and I'm sure everybody joining us for this session has had an equally great time. We'll see you tomorrow around the same time. Please look on the website for details for forthcoming panels. Thank you very much.